Usually, when a major geopolitical conflict hits the evening news, there's this like immediate, almost instinctual reaction we all have, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We watch the footage, we process the gravity of it, and then, well, we mentally brace ourselves for our next trip to the gas station.
Right. It's that classic cause and effect we've all been conditioned to expect. I mean, conflict in the Middle East basically equals a spike at the pump. It's highly visible, it's immediate, and, it hits your wallet before the week is even out.
Exactly. But what if I told you that while everyone is staring at the price of crude oil, there's a completely different, almost entirely invisible crisis unfolding, like a crisis that isn't happening at the pump, but miles above our heads in restricted airspace?
Yeah. And it's quietly echoing through these like pristine, sterile manufacturing plants that make the generic medication sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now.
Exactly. So for today's deep dive, we are mapping out the massive, totally unexpected ripple effects of the early March conflict where the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran. We're looking at a brilliant, really detailed breakdown by industry analyst Kaori Kido.
And she really shows how military actions halfway across the world are, well, directly threatening the Japanese pharmaceutical supply chain.
Right. And just to set the parameters here before we really get into the mechanics of this.
Yeah, that's important to clarify because, whenever we discuss recent military actions, things can understandably get a bit heated. But our deep dive today is entirely focused on the supply chain and economic realities outlined in Kido's source document.
Right, we're sticking to the logistics.
Exactly. We are objectively analyzing the fallout, the cargo ships, the flight paths, the manufacturing costs. We are absolutely not taking any political sides or evaluating the military decisions themselves.
No, not at all. We're just following the data and the cargo. And, to understand why your basic medicine might be at risk, we actually have to start by looking up at the sky. We have to move from the obvious impact of war, which is oil, to the physical reality of restricted airspace.
Right. And this is where the sheer kind of brittle complexity of global logistics really rears its head because we aren't just looking at one isolated event here. We're looking at a compounding airspace crisis.
Compounding? How so?
Well, if we rewind a bit to the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, the geopolitical fallout resulted in Japanese and Western airlines being banned from Russian airspace entirely.
Oh, wow. Which, I mean, that is a massive expanse of skies to suddenly lose access to. It's essentially the most direct flight path between Asia and Europe, isn't it?
It is. It totally is. Losing it forced airlines into a massive detour over Africa just to get flights from Japan to Europe. And that single change, it added an extra 3 hours of flight time.
3 extra hours? That's a lot of fuel.
Yeah, but here is the critical part that people miss. 3 hours of extra flight time doesn't just mean the pilot gets home later, right? It physically changes the physics of the flight.
Wait, what do you mean by the physics of the flight?
So airplanes have a maximum allowable takeoff weight. If a detour requires 3 extra hours of flying, that plane has to carry thousands of extra gallons of heavy jet fuel.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. To compensate for that massive weight increase, the airline literally has to offload cargo.
Man.
So not only is the flight taking longer, costing more in fuel, and requiring more crew time, it is physically carrying fewer pallets of goods every single day.
Wow. Okay, so you're burning more money to transport fewer things, and the global system absorbed that barely, I guess. But Kido points out that this recent Middle East conflict has added a second massive detour on top of the first one, right?
Exactly. And she provides a really striking personal anecdote to illustrate this bottleneck. So Kido currently works for an Indian company. Now, normally, Indian professionals and their cargo rely heavily on Middle Eastern airlines.
Like Emirates, right?
Yeah, companies like Emirates to travel via Dubai to get to Europe and the U.S. I mean, Dubai is one of the most critical global connecting hubs in the world.
But because of the conflict in March, that major global hub route became severely restricted.
Exactly. So we are just talking about tourists having to reschedule vacations here. This is actively crippling the movement of vital cargo and the business professionals who actually manage these global supply chains.
It's the compounding nature of it that is so wild. Like, the global logistics map is literally running out of alternative routes. It's like, okay, imagine a massive highway pileup forced you onto a side street.
Okay, yeah.
But now that side street just got closed for emergency construction. You're completely boxed in, you have nowhere to detour, and the meter on your taxi is just running up.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And every time a road gets restricted, fuel costs rise, shipping costs rise, and we see like an immediate increase in canceled or heavily delayed cargo flights.
Which brings us to the big pivot in Kido's presentation. I mean, I think anyone can understand why flights are delayed when airspace closes. But why does a detour over Dubai cripple the Japanese pharmaceutical industry specifically?
Right, that's the big question.
This is where the source material drops a fact that honestly completely changed how I view the region, because we're so heavily conditioned to think of Iran purely as an oil-producing nation.
Oh, absolutely. We lump it in with other neighboring nations as strictly a petroleum powerhouse. But Kido highlights a crucial, often overlooked reality. Iran is a massive manufacturing nation.
Okay, but manufacturing what exactly?
They are a primary global exporter of chemical intermediates and raw chemicals.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. We aren't just talking about the fuel cost to fly finished packaged pills to a pharmacy in Tokyo.
No.
We are talking about the fundamental chemical building blocks inside the pills themselves becoming too expensive to manufacture in the first place.
Yeah, it's even deeper than that, actually, because when you take a pill, you are ingesting two main things. First, you have the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API, that is the actual medicine doing the work in your body.
Right, the stuff that actually fixes the headache.
Exactly. But then you have excipients. These are the inactive substances that bind the pill together, stabilize it, or, help your body absorb it. Both APIs and excipients often rely heavily on petrochemicals and raw chemical exports from places like Iran.
Oh, wow.
And beyond the pill itself, think about the plastic blister packs holding them, or the sterile packaging. If that raw chemical supply from Iran is choked off, the entire manufacturing line in India or China just starves.
So if that chemical pipeline gets disrupted, how bad does it actually get for the companies making our generic drugs? Because Kido maps out a few different scenarios depending on how long this conflict lasts, and it escalates incredibly fast.
It really does. So let's look at what she calls a mild ripple effect. Say the conflict stays relatively contained.
Okay, so mild scenario, what does that look like?
In that mild scenario, we see a slight fluctuation in oil prices. That leads to a minor, maybe, a few percent increase in manufacturing costs. There are no massive new permanent detours required, and insurance premiums for shipping only bump up slightly.
So basically a short-term headache. Kido notes that generic drug companies can survive this, right? Like they can absorb a tiny hit to their margins.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah.
But she puts a massive ticking clock on this. She states, this mild scenario only holds up if the conflict doesn't drag on past April.
If it does?
Then the math changes completely. It shifts to a moderate crisis.
Okay, walk me through the moderate crisis.
This is where oil prices stay high for a sustained period, and the cost of those raw petrochemicals and plastics jumps by 10 to 20%.
10 to 20%. So the cost of making the APIs, the binding agents, and all that specific medical-grade packaging suddenly spikes.
Yep. And on top of those raw material costs, the logistics costs compound heavily. Middle Eastern transit routes remain restricted, forcing constant detours. Air freight experiences regular delays and cancellations.
Because the routes are just so messed up.
Exactly. Because the routes are longer and riskier, transport fares go up, and insurance premiums rise significantly. So for low-margin generic drug companies, this pushes them straight into short-term deficits. I mean, they literally start bleeding money on every single pill they produce.
Which is alarming enough, but then Kido outlines the nightmare scenario, right? A severe, prolonged conflict.
Yeah, and this is where it gets scary. If the region destabilizes further, major chemical exports from Iran could halt entirely. We aren't looking at a 10 or 20% increase anymore. Kido projects a 30% or more surge in the cost of active pharmaceutical ingredients.
A 30% cost increase on the raw ingredients alone. I mean, how do you even ship that if the airspace is already a mess?
Well, the logistics become a complete nightmare. The Middle East sea routes become virtually unusable, requiring massive maritime detours around the entire continent of Africa. Marine insurance spikes aggressively, and shipping companies are forced to add specific war risk insurance premiums just to enter certain waters, which are astronomically expensive.
So what happens to the generic drug companies in Japan when they face a 30% material spike plus these insane wartime shipping fees?
It breaks them. Kido points out that under this severe scenario, generic drug companies would be forced to halt production lines entirely. They would severely delay shipments or just, completely withdraw certain vital medicines from the market because they literally cannot afford the raw materials to make them anymore.
That is a terrifying prospect, but it really makes me question the business model here. I mean, if my supplier gets too expensive or the shipping from one region spikes, I just go to a competitor. Why can't these massive pharma companies just adapt?
Right, like just pick a new vendor.
Yeah. Why not just call up a different factory in a different country that isn't relying on Iranian chemicals?
Because medicine isn't like buying office supplies. This really exposes a fundamentally brittle business model at the heart of the generic drug industry. We like to imagine these companies as impenetrable fortresses of supply, but Kido details a few core vulnerabilities in the Japanese generic drug supply chain that make them incredibly fragile.
Okay, so what's the first vulnerability?
The first is severe regulatory lock-in. Japan relies heavily on Europe, China, and India for its APIs, but they often depend on a single specific country or even one single factory within that country for a critical ingredient.
But again, if that one factory goes offline, why not pivot?
You can't just switch vendors overnight. The pharmaceutical industry requires incredibly strict quality certifications and regulatory approvals for every single ingredient. You can't just buy a barrel of chemicals from a new guy.
Right, because it's going to human bodies.
Exactly. You have to run molecular purity tests, conduct clinical trials, and get government stamps of approval for that specific new facility. Validating a new supplier takes months, sometimes even years.
Okay, but here's what I don't get. Kido brings up the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake in her presentation. Japan experienced one of the most catastrophic supply chain disruptions in modern history, and the government strongly pushed pharmaceutical companies to diversify their supply chains after that, right? To not put all their eggs in one basket. Are you telling me they just didn't?
Yeah, they largely didn't.
How is that legally allowed for critical medicine?
Well, to understand why, you have to look at the second major vulnerability Kido identifies: the sheer economics of generic drugs. The reason they didn't diversify is that it costs a fortune to maintain multiple certified suppliers. And generic drugs are, by their very design, a thin-margin business.
Well, yeah, they are supposed to be cheap for the consumer. That's the whole point of a generic alternative.
True, but these companies have been taking hits for years. Between the massive logistics spikes during the COVID-19 pandemic and the historically weak Japanese yen, these companies have lost a tremendous amount of purchasing power on the global market.
And they can't just pass that cost along.
No, and here is the real kicker that prevents them from adapting. Japan has a very rigid, government-controlled drug pricing system.
Wait. So if the cost of raw materials goes up 30% because of a war in the Middle East, the pharmaceutical company cannot just raise the price of the drug at the pharmacy by 30% to cover their costs.
They absolutely cannot. The price is locked by the government to keep healthcare affordable for citizens.
Oh my gosh. It's like running a bakery where the price of flour just tripled because of a bad harvest, but the government says you are legally forbidden from charging more than $2 for a loaf of bread. You're going to just stop baking bread.
Exactly. They just have to eat the loss until they can't afford to produce the drug at all.
Okay, but surely these multi-billion-dollar healthcare systems aren't flying by the seat of their pants. They must have massive warehouses of backup supplies to weather the storm, right?
Yeah.
Like, dip into the cash reserves, use the backup chemicals until the conflict cools down.
You would think so. But that brings us to the third massive vulnerability. They don't have backup warehouses. Yeah. To save money, these companies utilize a just-in-time inventory system.
Seriously, they use just-in-time for life-saving medicine.
Yes. They don't have vast stockpiles of raw chemicals. They order exactly what they need, exactly when they need it for the production line. Any excess inventory is viewed as trapped capital.
It's like the Marie Kondo approach to pharmaceutical manufacturing. If this barrel of raw chemicals doesn't spark immediate joy on the assembly line today, we don't keep it in the warehouse, which is, great for corporate decluttering, but absolutely terrible if a war breaks out over your shipping route.
It creates a system where the margin for error is essentially zero. Any transport delay, a restricted airspace, a rerouted cargo ship due to maritime conflict instantly shatters their production schedules.
It's a domino effect.
It's a brutal domino effect. A conflict in the Middle East delays a shipment of intermediates from Iran. That delays the API manufacturing in India, which misses the just-in-time cargo flight to Japan, which stops the manufacturing line in Osaka, which results in a shortage of blood pressure medication at your local pharmacy a few weeks later.
This picture Kido paints is incredibly bleak. I mean, we have a system relying on single foreign suppliers, operating on razor-thin margins locked by the government, with zero backup inventory, all existing in a world where airspace is closing and raw chemical prices are highly volatile.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm.
This sounds like a massive public health threat. So, I mean, the most obvious solution seems to be just make the medicine at home. Why doesn't Japan just build factories and manufacture all its own APIs domestically?
That is the natural conclusion to draw, absolutely. But Kido is very quick to outline the cold reality of why that is a pipe dream in the short term. She does offer short-term survival recommendations for companies, though.
Like,
Things like performing triage to immediately prioritize which APIs are absolutely essential, desperately trying to build up safety stock now, and urgently front-loading the technical evaluations of alternative suppliers.
basically patching the biggest holes in the boat so it doesn't sink today?
Right. But the long-term reality of bringing API manufacturing back to Japan, Kaido states that is a minimum 10-year process. You can't just flip a switch and say, we make chemicals now.
Because of the regulations.
Regulations, yeah.
Yeah.
It requires building highly specialized, heavily regulated new facilities. It requires training specialized personnel that currently don't even exist in the domestic workforce. And it requires a massive restructuring of costs.
Because, again, it comes back to those margins. Japanese domestic manufacturing simply cannot undercut the massive scale and low production prices in China or India. It's economically impossible without immense outside help.
Which shifts the entire conversation. Kido makes a brilliant point here. Ensuring a stable supply of medicine can no longer just be a corporate responsibility. Thin-margin generic companies simply cannot afford to build redundant, resilient supply chains on their own while operating under government price controls.
So it has to go higher up.
Yes, the burden has to shift to a government and diplomatic level.
So what does that actually look like in practice? How does a government fix a broken global supply chain?
Well, it means the Japanese government has to step in with major domestic subsidies, tax breaks, or a total overhaul of that rigid drug pricing system we talked about to allow companies to actually make a profit.
Okay, that's domestic. What about internationally?
Beyond domestic policy, it requires serious diplomatic action. The government must establish strategic supply agreements with these manufacturing nations. They need to form alliances that guarantee the flow of essential medical chemicals even during times of geopolitical crisis or war.
Wow. It's incredible to step back and look at this. The ultimate irony here, for you listening, is that the very system designed to keep your healthcare affordable, this relentless drive for cheap generic drugs, is exactly what makes your healthcare system incredibly vulnerable to a single geopolitical shock. The pursuit of extreme cost efficiency just, well, stripped away all the shock absorbers.
It really forces a broader societal debate, as Kido points out. It comes down to how much the social security system, and by extension, the taxpayers are willing to pay for supply chain resilience.
Right.
Do we want incredibly cheap medicine when times are perfectly peaceful, knowing that the supply might completely disappear during a global crisis? Or, are we willing to pay slightly more every single day to ensure those factories keep running when the world gets unpredictable?
It changes how you look at the world completely. This is the flip side of the affordable healthcare we all rely on. The reason your copay is so low is the exact same reason the supply chain is one delayed flight away from collapse. The next time you go to the pharmacy and pick up a basic, inexpensive prescription, maybe it costs you just a few dollars. Take a moment to really look at that tiny plastic bottle. Because what you are holding isn't just a simple commercial product.
No, it's not.
It is a fragile miracle of global logistics. It represents a perfectly timed, highly vulnerable dance of Iranian chemical intermediates, Indian manufacturing, Dubai transit hubs, and a razor-thin margin of global peace.
And I'll leave you with one final thought to ponder based on Kido's analysis. We spend trillions of dollars globally securing our physical borders, protecting our power grids, and maintaining military readiness. But if the fundamental building blocks of our basic life-saving medicines are this vulnerable to a regional conflict thousands of miles away, shouldn't we stop treating pharmaceutical supply chains as just another sector of private business? Is it time we start treating them as critical national defense infrastructure on the exact same level as our military or our energy grid?
That is something to seriously think about the next time geopolitical news flashes across your screen and you catch yourself only worrying about the price of gas. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden world of pharmaceutical logistics. Until next time, stay curious.